and we will get started.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm glad that you're all here. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn at Ollie. I'm your host today, as Jessica just talked about. Our speaker today is Danielle Vinson, who's Furman's Professor of Politics and International Affairs. She's a frequent speaker and communicator, not only to us Ollie folks who have grown to love her and look forward to when she can drag herself away from her other activities to be able to share her brilliance with us. But she's given talks, as you might well imagine, in this election year with a bunch of folks, including Furman alumni, maybe some trustees, and also importantly for everybody is the press takes quite an active interest in her views and her intellect as it relates to the politics. So she's very popular, and we're lucky to get her for this election year. What she does in her day job is teaches courses on Congress, the presidency, media, which has really been a hot thing in this last 4 years with do you trust media or do you not trust media, with pros and cons on both sides. Politics, American government. And in addition, you've heard some talk about Furman Advantage, both from the president, and I had the vice VP of Student Affairs a couple of years ago talk about this thing that's called Furman Advantage. Well, actually, Danielle, really, before it was named, was at the forefront. She regularly directs the department's Washington internship program, which she just loves, and that's in residence in DC. And it's a great advantage for Furman students to be able to do that, and I suspect it's pretty hard to get in. Jessica's already told you about using the chat button, and that's fine. We'll try and stop at 1:10 to start talking about your questions, your views, type of thing. Just as a reminder, that's not an opportunity to voice your personal political opinions, but it is your opportunity to ask questions, and that would be great. Again, this video, Lunch and Learn, is open to the public, and so it will be published on our YouTube site. So even if you're not a member of Ollie, you know somebody who's thinking about joining Ollie, what's it about, it's a great way of giving them some insight in that learning doesn't have to stop when you retire. Well, if you look at academically, Danielle actually went to Furman, and yes, she graduated. And then she received her master's and PhD from Duke University. And then, being homesick, she returned to the Furman campus to teach here as well. Her topic today is, generally speaking, where are we headed? Presidential election in today's seemingly dysfunctional political times. So Danielle, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much. It's good to be with y'all today. And I am going to get a little bit of help with my presentation from the animals at the National Zoo. If you're like me, you're kind of tired of presidential candidates and Senate candidates right about now, so you don't want to see any more politicians. And my experience is the animals do a very nice job of capturing human emotions. And so we will use them. Any likeness they might bear to actual candidates is purely coincidental, and I have not doctored any of these photos. So let me share my screen with you and get this thing started. All right, there we go. And I need to move this over here where it's not going to be in the middle of my notes. All right, so it's 2020, and I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a pandemic. To go with our pandemic, we have a divided Congress. We have ongoing protests around racial injustice around the country. We have wildfires. We have controversial Supreme Court nominations that have just concluded. And we have a politicization of nearly everything in our lives, including our responses to the pandemic, the civil service, if or how we use science, 60 Minutes, the US Postal Service, social media, and probably our relationships with our neighbors right now. Everything seems to be politicized. And in the specific context of this election, we have a Republican incumbent president who defies the norms of politics. We have a Democratic candidate with more than 4 decades of experience in politics who's chosen an African American woman as his running mate. And we have competing concerns about voter fraud and voter suppression. We're not sure if our state election systems or the US Postal Service are going to be able to handle the expected record turnout. Oh, and yes, there are questions about Russia, Iran, and China interfering in our election. It's enough to make you want to run and hide in the corner. But today we're going to try to make some sense of this. We're going to think a little bit about how all of this stuff matters and where we're headed in this election. Usually in political science, we look first at sort of the underlying party advantages that each party has. Some of that's built in from year to year, right? South Carolina, for example, has traditionally been a Republican state. And so we would start with the assumption that Republican presidential candidate, Republican Senate candidates have an advantage in South Carolina. In contrast, somewhere like California is going to definitely have an advantage for Democrats statewide. And so that's the easy part of our job as political science, is to kind of look at the underlying party dynamics within a state. The more challenging part is what's going to actually matter in each specific election. So, for example, is there anything going on nationally or in the state that would change the underlying party dynamics in a place like South Carolina? Not as likely, but in a place like Georgia or North Carolina or Florida or any of those other so-called swing states, those underlying issues may in fact change the party dynamics that we expect in those states. And so the 3 things that we typically consider as we're looking at what's really going to matter in an election and what's ultimately going to decide that election, we look at the candidates, we look at the issues that are salient or important to voters in that particular election, and we look at the national mood. Now, if you think back to 2016 for a minute, you might recall that seemed to be an awful lot about the 2 candidates, particularly which one of them you found least objectionable. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had record unfavorable ratings in polls leading up to that election. And so a lot of people, and particularly a large number of undecided voters in the final weeks of the election, were really sorting out which candidate they felt most comfortable with, given that they weren't terribly comfortable with either of them. There were a number of issues that were important to folks in the last election. The economy was one of them, of course. The Supreme Court and the balance of the courts was another issue. But particularly, people were just interested in, did they trust Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump over a broad range of issues? This election is a little different. This election is about a candidate, but it's not so much about both candidates as I think it's really about one candidate. And that candidate, of course, is our sitting president, Donald Trump. And at this point in his tenure as president, there are not a lot of people still sitting on the fence about him. Most folks have made up their minds whether they like him or they don't like him. And so when we think about the issues, the candidates, and the national mood in this election, a lot of it is going to be through the lens of Donald Trump. And I want to start today by looking at the issues that seem to be on voters' minds this time around and how that's playing with the electorate right now. We're going to look at sort of two things as we look at these elections. One is how people think Trump has done on a particular issue, and which voters seem to be happy or unhappy with that. And we'll also look at the way the president has framed these issues, because how he's talking about them is influencing how voters think about them and how some voters are talking about them. And that affects the way that they'll interact with what actually happens on election day. So the number one issue that's on everybody's mind is this pandemic. I think it is safe to say that nearly every single person in this country has been directly affected by the pandemic in some way. If you don't know someone that's had it or you haven't had it, you at least have had your life altered somewhat because of it. I know my students are still trying to adjust to a world in which I can only see half of their faces in my classroom. I cannot tell who's puzzled and who's not. Similarly, I am trying to adjust to that. I am trying to adjust to talking to you through a screen in which I cannot see all of you. So I don't know if you are happy with what I'm saying or unhappy or puzzled by it. Hopefully we'll clarify that in the chat. But we're all adjusting in that sense. Some of you know people who have been even more directly affected by this. You may have found yourself more restricted in your ability to get out and do things. You're having this class online instead of in person. We know some of our older folks in society who are in nursing homes or assisted living facilities that have shut down to visitors at various points during this, leading to a lot of isolation. So we find that there are a lot of people from the very young to the much older who have had the pandemic affect their lives. So that is without a doubt the number one issue on people's minds. The interesting thing as we look at the way the president's dealt with the pandemic is he has sort of set it up as a either or situation where on the one hand, you either give in to the pandemic and you lock everything down, or you work to keep the economy open and thriving. And so a lot of his supporters, those core folks that are really behind him, have supported his argument that you can't give in to the pandemic, you can't shut everything down. His criticisms of governors who have tried to impose shutdowns across their state, particularly early on in this process, he's been very critical of that in the name of keeping the economy going, restoring those jobs that were lost in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic arriving in the United States. And so he sets this up as sort of, you can choose the economy or you can choose to do the things that are necessary to control the pandemic. Biden, on the other hand, has taken a different approach. He's focused more on control the pandemic as a way of dealing with the economy. And if you get the pandemic under control, the economy will begin to take care of itself. The interesting thing is looking at how this issue has played for voters and which voters this issue activates. With the pandemic, Trump supporters are completely with him on this focus on the economy. You can tell that when you look at his rallies. They are still showing up in full force, cheering him on and very enthusiastic. But there are a couple of groups in the electorate that did vote, at least in large numbers, for Donald Trump in 2016 that are not as pleased with his performance on the pandemic. We have noticed a slight shift in older Americans, that group over 65, that has started weakening in their support for Trump. Trump won that group by not a huge margin, but a fairly reasonable margin in the last election. But polls right now are suggesting that Biden is actually doing slightly better among that group. And so we're seeing some concerns about whether senior citizens are going to support the Republican ticket in the way that they had 4 years ago. That could spell problems for Trump, especially in a place like Florida that he won last time around. That begins to be a big concern. Another group that we see having concerns about his handling of the pandemic are suburban women. And again, this is a group that Trump won white, non-college educated women quite handily last time around. He's still ahead with that group, but their support has dropped considerably. Even among white college-educated women, those that you often associate with the suburbs, Trump did better than expected with that group last time around. Hillary did not win them by as much as she had hoped to win. And this time around, they are heavily shifting. And one of the reasons they're heavily shifting toward the Democrats is because of the pandemic. I actually got to observe this kind of secondhand back in the spring. I had a group of students in Washington with me as part of our internship program, and we all got sent home about mid-March. And so suddenly you've got two classes that are supposed to be all about internships, and those internships don't exist, and it's only midterm, and you got to find something to do with your students for the next 6 weeks. And so we shifted our attention. Instead of participant observation and what we can learn through an internship, we shifted to participant observation during a pandemic. And the students replaced their journals about their internships with journals about what they were observing in their daily life related to the pandemic and how their families and their communities were adjusting to it, what they were seeing their local government do. And one of the things that struck me almost immediately, the first meeting we had after about a week of being home, my students who were from conservative families were noting a difference between mom and dad. Dad was fussing about the economy being locked down and not being able to go to work like he was used to doing, and he was ready to get things open back up. Moms, on the other hand, were watching their governors, some of them in conservative states, who weren't doing much about the pandemic, and they were getting peeved. Some of them were starting to get frustrated when the CDC and others started suggesting you should wear masks. These moms were saying to their kids, you gotta wear masks, and getting really irritated with the politicians that weren't taking those things seriously. And so I was starting to get a sense then that maybe some of these suburban women were not happy with their leadership. And so some of them have started shifting over toward the other side. So that pandemic is activating some of these voters that had supported Trump last time around, and may discourage them from doing that this time. Second big issue that also revolves in some ways around the president's response to it and how he's framed it are the racial justice, social justice issues that have emerged, particularly over the summer in the wake of the death of George Floyd during an encounter with police officers. And this particular situation, we've seen two very different things emerge. First of all, with the protests, the massive number of protests across the country. We even experienced them here in South Carolina. There were protests in Greenville, Columbia, and Charleston over several days. Not quite like we saw out in Portland, Oregon, where they literally were every day for months. But we were seeing these kinds of protests emerge everywhere. As is often the case in protest, and there was a small minority that decided to go violent in those protests. And so you saw the media coverage focusing a lot on the violence, even though going back and looking at it statistically, it wasn't a majority of the protests that turned violent. The president noticed that, his supporters noticed that. And rather than talk more explicitly about the racial justice concerns themselves, the president pivoted to a conversation he's more comfortable having, which is support of the police and this law and order idea. And so you've seen throughout the summer and into the fall, the issues of racial justice being dealt with very differently. On the one hand, the media are often focused on social justice, racial justice. The Democrats talk more about that. The president spins this as a law and order issue and a need to support the police and keep our communities safe. That's had a very interesting effect on different groups of people. Again, the president's core supporters like what he's saying. They tend to support the police. They've always supported the police. And they tend to like what he's saying about law and order. On the other side, you've got minorities and young people, both of whom were very involved in these protests throughout the summer. In that sense, the protests and these events took place at an opportune moment. Coronavirus wiped out a lot of summer jobs for students. A lot of summer internships went online. And people had ridiculous amounts of time on their hands. And so it gave them an opportunity to participate in protests through the week that they normally would not have been able to do because of work. And so you saw a lot of minorities and a lot of young people out there protesting and raising awareness among themselves about this issue. And the likelihood is that group is very activated in this election, partly as a result of those protests and this racial justice issue. We are seeing them register. We are seeing them participate in early voting in record numbers right now. Now, whether that means they also show up on election day and continue to expand the electorate in that way remains to be seen. But for right now, they're clearly energized about this issue, and they're not happy with the president on this issue. Another group that we're kind of watching on this issue, Trump has made a direct appeal to folks in the suburbs on the law and order issue. And it's not yet clear how that's going to play among traditionally Republican conservatives who are in the suburbs. There are signs in the polling that, again, suburban women may not be as receptive to that law and order frame as they are to the racial justice frame. And so we will see how that plays out. But again, that issue, partly because of the way the president's approached it, is energizing certain groups of voters and leading us to keep an eye on how it actually affects the electorate. Will it expand the electorate? Third big issue is healthcare. Part of that's because of the pandemic, and the other part of that is because for 4 years, the president has tried to undo the Affordable Care Act. He's had some success in certain areas. He's taken away the mandate from that piece of legislation and decided not to enforce it. Literally a week after the election, or within a week or so after the election, the Supreme Court will be hearing another case that could very well spell the complete undoing of the Affordable Care Act, depending on how the justices rule. Trump made that an important part of his presidency. It wasn't done through Congress. Congress could not agree on a replacement, and so we haven't gotten that through Congress. But how that healthcare issue plays in the public right now is an interesting question. Again, the president's base is all for it. They don't like Obamacare. On the other side, there are people who have now spent almost 10 years receiving much of their health insurance through the Affordable Care Act's provisions, and they're concerned about how that might be undone. And so some of them are becoming more energized about this election. So we will see how this plays out, particularly in some key states, because I don't think we're completely certain how it will play out among all voters. Finally, down here, you'll notice I haven't talked a whole lot about what Joe Biden's done on these issues or Joe Biden's position on these issues. And quite frankly, it's because most voters don't seem to care. If they like Donald Trump, they're not voting for Joe Biden, no matter what his position is on these issues. And if they don't like Donald Trump, they're not sure that really matters what Joe Biden's position is on the issues, because they think it'll be different than Donald Trump. I think the one issue that we've seen people genuinely do care what Biden thinks is on the question of what will happen to the courts if Biden were to be elected president. Would he expand the size of the Supreme Court, for example? Biden kind of dodged that question in the first debate, wouldn't answer it. And right before the second debate, he announced that he would appoint a commission or committee to look at the issue and see what could be done, if anything needs to be done, to try to slow down the politicization of the courts. Because one thing both sides would agree on is you don't want the courts to be seen strictly as partisan institutions to be fought over by increasing, decreasing the size of the court at any given time. And so that's one we're going to watch. There actually are things that he could do legislatively if Democrats were to win the White House and Congress. There are a number of things that they could do to clarify existing legislation that might come before the court, to make it harder for the court to interpret the legislation. It could be clearer in its interpretation. A lot of laws that we pass are very ambiguous, and so we rely on the court to help us figure out what do these things mean. there are things beyond just expanding the size of the court that could be done. But I think honestly, that's the one issue people care what Joe Biden thinks on. Beyond that, Democrats have decided that any Democrat will do rather than Trump. And it's those small sliver of folks in the middle that are still kind of deciding. And some of those Republicans who may be disenchanted with the president on some of these issues, their question is going to be, are they unhappy enough to move over and vote for the Democrats or possibly a third party? Or are they going to sort of bite their tongue and continue to vote for Trump? So we will see how this all affects the voters and who shows up. Second thing that we really need to look at, though, are the candidates themselves. We know them both. We've had Donald Trump as president for 4 years. He has made sure that we are aware of his presence. There is no forgetting this particular president. Those that love him love the fact that he is confident. He is a fighter. He's going to fight for the issues he told them he would fight for. They like that feistiness. They like that he has completely upended Washington and the political norms of office. That was part of his appeal to them. And the reality is they knew what they were getting, right? Donald Trump didn't change to run for president. Donald Trump has been Donald Trump for decades that he's been in the public eye. And so the folks that were surprised that Trump did not settle down and become, quote, presidential, those folks were deluding themselves to begin with. It is my experience that once you hit a certain age, you are unlikely to change your entire style of doing things and your way of doing things. You've worked hard to develop that style. And so for those that thought Trump would somehow miraculously become more of a normal character in the White House, I think they were kind of hoping and wishing rather than really thinking about reality. So for those folks that wanted that, they got it, and they've been happy about it. For others who may not have really liked that idea from the beginning, they might have voted for Trump because they cared about conservatives on the Supreme Court, even though they weren't real happy with Trump himself. Or they might have voted for Trump assuming that a Republican-controlled Congress could sort of tame him a little bit. Some of those folks are kind of tired of this. Democrats, of course, didn't like it from the beginning, and they're no happier with it now. But for those folks that don't like it, they feel like they've been overwhelmed by bombast and chaos for 4 years. I must say that as someone who studies this administration, it's exhausting. It never stops, right? I could always rely on George W. Bush or Barack Obama to shut down at 5 o'clock pretty much any day of the week, unless they were in a different time zone. This president does his best work after 5 o'clock. And so we're constantly, bombarded with him. So for those folks that weren't real happy with the style, they've not been able to escape it for 4 years. And right now, anyone that doesn't have this style is acceptable. Enter Joe Biden. He's kind of boring by comparison. Now, I find that funny because, like all of you, we can remember Joe Biden for a long time, right? I remember being in college the first time Joe Biden ran for president, and remembering that about him. And I've never really thought of Biden as boring in terms of Democrats generally. I mean, not the most exciting person in the room, but definitely not boring. Next to Trump, Biden looks downright dull. He gets a little nostalgic sometimes. Occasionally, he sticks his foot in his mouth. The president would like you to believe that is a sign of his of mental decline. I would simply say to the president, go back and look at the 1980s and 90s. There's plenty of video in the C-SPAN archives of Joe Biden sticking his foot in his mouth while presiding over committee hearings in Congress. It's what he does. Again, like Trump, some people like it about him and some people don't, but it's what he does. I think the most important thing, though, for voters who are kind of tired of the Trump show is that Biden does not tweet. Biden is not going to suddenly start tweeting at 3 in the morning. And for many people, that's a definite plus. So clear contrast between the candidates. I want to mention one word about the VP candidate on the Democratic side, because I think she actually is important for a certain segment of voters within the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, being an African-American woman, is historically important for this ticket. I think you had a lot of Democrats who were very energized in the primary because there was such diversity in the primary. And to end up with the oldest candidate and a white male was a little deflating to some of them. No offense to the white males who are watching. But they were hoping for something different this time. And putting Harris on the ticket is sort of a thank you, if you will, to African-American women who have been some of the staunchest supporters for the Democratic Party historically, at least in the modern era. And I think you can't underestimate the enthusiasm that has generated for some of them and for minority voters more generally, even among some of the young women that I teach, who were skeptical of Harris during the primaries, that she wasn't their choice during the primaries because of her record as a prosecutor, quite honestly. They were worried she would not be progressive enough. They were worried that she wouldn't deal as seriously with some of these issues related to police reform. But when she got nominated, when she got added to the ticket as the vice presidential candidate, I talked to one of them who'd been very vocal, and she's like, I finally see myself on a presidential ticket, and that's important to me. So I think we can't underestimate that. I think 4 years ago, Pence was playing a similar kind of role for evangelical Christians among the Republicans, right? Trump put him on the ticket as a way to reach out to evangelicals and convince them that Trump himself would be okay. If Pence could run with this guy, then evangelicals could vote for this guy. Pence doesn't need to play that role as much this time around. I think evangelicals are still some of the staunchest Trump supporters out there. They've been happy with the Supreme Court appointments particularly. But I think Harris does a similar kind of thing for Democrats this time around. All right, finally, we want to look at the national mood. It's not so good. There's a lot of fear and anger out there. The numbers aren't that much different from 4 years ago when you ask people, is the country headed in the right direction? Still more than 60% of the country is not saying we're headed in the right direction, though for different reasons. But one of the things I'm seeing this time around that I've not seen as much in past elections, and that is the fear and anger. Fear on both sides that a win by the opposing side would be apocalyptic. Anger about the way they think about what the other side wants to do. You see real challenging of people's patriotism, commitment to the Constitution. And you've seen that in some of the protests. We've had several incidents in recent days where literal fights have broken out and people have been arrested while waiting in line to vote between Trump and Biden supporters. So that fear and anger is real this time around. And it is leading to high turnout. We are expecting record highs this time around. We've already achieved record early voting and record absentee voting requests. So we will definitely be seeing that fear and anger play out, and how quickly and in what direction this election is decided will tell us a lot about what we expect in terms of people's reactions in the days following the election. So in this final week, there's a bit of anxiety for a lot of reasons. First of all, there's the pandemic. Are there going to be more outbreaks? How will that affect people's ability to vote? That's part of why you see people voting early, is to try to make sure they vote while they're healthy in case things get worse where they live. We also have seen it among the vice president's staff. He's still traveling, coming to South Carolina. Wear your masks, please. But he's going to be in the state. He's going to be in 2 places in North Carolina. And so the candidates are trying not to let this slow down what they're doing in the final week of the campaign. But the reality of how those outbreaks within the campaigns themselves can affect what's going on the campaign trail. Money is becoming a concern in the final week, at least for Trump. They're a little low on cash, and that's causing them to have to make strategic decisions about where they're spending their money and where they're running ads in this last week of the election. There are a lot more states in play than we had 4 years ago, and so I think that can spread you thin. You've got to be careful about where you run that advertising. And then finally, we're on record pace for turnout. That's raising a lot of interesting questions for us. One is simply who's going to turn out. We do not actually know fully who's going to show up in this election. Both parties are trying to expand the electorate, add more of their own people to the electorate. For Democrats, that would be minorities and younger voters, particularly. Right now, both those groups are running well ahead of what they did last time around, just in the early voting. But the question is, are there any of them left over to vote on Election Day? For Republicans, they've tried to expand registration, and we have indeed, in some key states, seen expansion of voter registration among Republicans. The one question that still remains is, will those Republicans who are newly added to the rolls, are they going to vote for Republicans or not? Just because you registered for the party doesn't necessarily mean you're going to vote for it, and that's something we don't know until the votes are counted. Along with this, we're having the back and forth over concerns about voter fraud and concerns about voter suppression. And that's all playing out in state election commissions and the courts. Can the state election commissions handle counting all of these ballots? Can they handle the lines that are emerging right now in early voting and potentially on Election Day? All of those questions remain to be seen. Another issue that's going to be of concern in the aftermath is how many of the mail-in ballots actually get rejected. We've had Supreme Court cases in the last couple of weeks that have said they have to be in election offices in two key states, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Actually, I'm not sure about Pennsylvania. I know they made the ruling last night in Wisconsin, but they're going to have to, they can only count what's actually received by Election Day. Some in the state were pushing to extend that as long as they had been mailed before Election Day, that they would be able to continue to count them after they arrive after Election Day. So how slow the Postal Service goes may determine some of this. How many signatures don't match the voter registration signature? Some states allow voters to be contacted and asked to correct that. If the signature's off, they will call the voter and say, is this really your ballot? The voter can come attest that yes, it is, or no, it's not. But a lot of states don't give voters that option. If somebody in the election office decides the voter signatures are too different, they will throw it out. So how many mail-in ballots actually get rejected is going to be an issue. And then, of course, there's the concerns about security of our elections from outside interference from Russia, China, Iran, or others. And that we do not know. So now that I've raised your anxiety level, let's see if I can lower it a little bit by answering some questions. And Dennis, I'll turn it over to you with the questions.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. A couple folks were interested in something other than the presidential election, and that was the state of South Carolina as it relates to the senatorial election in particular, I trust. And certainly there is an unheard of amount of money. I don't know, $58 million or something that dropped into one candidate's side. And here we are, and it would be untypical in recent years anyway, to shift from Republican to Democratic. What's really going on there? Is all that money a game changer? Or well, first question. Second part of the issue is South Carolina ready for a change? What's driving?
Yeah. This is what I was not counting on in the month of October. You mentioned my busy schedule. Normally, October in a general election year in South Carolina is just boring. We rely on North Carolina to give us our excitement. This time around, I was blasted by national reporters who wanted to know exactly what y'all are asking, which is what's going on in South Carolina. I started getting questions back in the summer, and at that point, I kept telling people the same thing, which is it's a Republican state. This is a little weird, but it's a Republican state. I'm still telling them it's a Republican state, but I'm also telling them now that there is a really strange combination of things that have all kind of happened at the same time to create a perfect storm. And if you ever were going to have a Democrat win statewide office again in South Carolina, this is the kind of context in which it could happen. And so what's going on? What's causing this? I think, first of all, the fact that Senator Graham did kind of do a 180 on President Trump has created a storyline that resonates with some people, right? He went from 2016, this guy is literally a disaster for the party, telling us why he could not stand the president, to now golfing with him and being one of his staunchest defenders in Congress. And that may not have mattered a lot to Republicans in South Carolina. It mattered a lot to Democrats in South Carolina because many of them, quite honestly, have been voting for Lindsey Graham pretty much his entire Senate career. They saw him as a reasonable Republican, and in South Carolina, you were going to have a Republican, so you might as well have a reasonable one. Have a reasonable Republican who will, on some issues, reach across party lines. He wanted to be a problem solver, and that was more important to him than ideology. And so that appealed to independents and Democrats in the state. So many of them were used to supporting him, and when he went all in on Trump, they were horrified. I kept getting emails and questions every time I'd appear in a group of people. It's like, where is Lindsey Graham gone? Before Jamie Harrison ever launched that ad saying the same thing. So that was part of it. But beyond giving Jamie Harrison something to use against Graham, it resonated nationally. People nationally are used to seeing Lindsey Graham. I don't know if y'all realize this, but our senator gets covered on Sunday morning talk shows historically starting about year 2 of his time in the Senate. He has been the most likely senator to be on a Sunday morning talk show with literally 10 or 20 more appearances a year than even the party leaders. He's just very accessible to the national media. That tendency to say what he thinks and not worry so much about diplomatic niceties appeals to them, and they just found him fascinating. And so for years now, the nation has been seeing Lindsey Graham on television, and he was this person who would tell it to his own party, who would reach across party lines. So when he shifted and became one of these staunch defenders, and I think really the moment it struck people was during the Kavanaugh hearings, when he just exploded in frustration at the way the hearing was going against Kavanaugh. It did really well with his conservative supporters in the state, and particularly some of those conservatives that never trusted him because he went across party lines. They loved that moment. But for the national audience watching that, and it got a lot of airplay on national news, they were horrified. And that's when you started seeing money flow into Jamie Harrison's campaign, was those people started thinking about there needs to be an alternative. The Democratic Party in the state was very smart in clearing the field and getting the person that was thinking about challenging Harrison, and in fact, who had already announced she was going to challenge Harrison for the Democratic nomination. They convinced her to step aside very early in the process. And that meant all that money that was coming in to go against Lindsey Graham was going straight to Jamie Harrison's campaign. And it allowed him to go up on the air early in the spring instead of fighting for a primary win to start fighting the general election. It totally took Graham by surprise. They let Harrison stay up on the air uncontested with those beautiful bio ads. I don't know who was doing those ads, but they were beautiful. But they stayed up on the air for a couple of months before Lindsey ever got on the air with his own ads and ever started challenging the narrative. So that gave Jamie a chance to introduce himself to people. The issues over the summer, the racial justice issues, again, mobilized Democrats in the state, mobilized young people, both of which give him an opportunity to expand the electorate. I mean, you think about it, Democrats don't usually have a reason to show up in a general election for statewide office in South Carolina. This time around, they have got one. He's made a convincing argument. His personal story is very attractive. He doesn't seem scary to most people. And because Graham let him kind of define himself to begin with, those ads now trying to link him to the liberal far left wing of the Democratic Party aren't having the same kind of effect they might have had if they had run much earlier in the campaign. And that money at this point, it's just allowing him to saturate literally every form of media in the state. He's advertising in Georgia markets and North Carolina markets to catch the edges of South Carolina. If there were a television station in the Atlantic Ocean, he'd have the money right now to advertise on it.
Okay.
So he's everywhere.
We have a couple of questions that go to international. One question is a general one on the on your issues list that you started with. International relations, or our relations with foreign governments and countries, didn't make the short list as being an issue. What do you think about that?
Typically, most American voters only tune into international issues when they seem to be having a negative effect on us very directly. So you see some concern about, the role that China plays in the world, for example. Trump has gained supporters by, playing hardball with China when it came to tariffs. But most voters, unless we are literally at war, the international issues made a lot of difference during the early days of the war on terrorism following the 9/11 disasters or terrorist attacks. But you don't see voters caring a lot or mentioning that as one of their top issues when they're faced with so many other things domestically. You're more likely to see international issues rising to the top when there's specific incidents. So it's not that it's not important to certain groups of voters. It's certainly important to the international community. They're very interested in how we're going to deal with this election. But it doesn't typically rise to the top three issues that most voters are thinking about as they head into this election. Pandemic, racial justice, healthcare, the economy. Those are the issues that seem to be more on people's minds right now.
The other related question is, how do you see, and what do you see with outside countries trying to affect our electorate?
I think it's hard to tell, and part of the reason it's hard to tell is because this is another area that's sort of been politicized, is our intelligence gathering and briefing. Right now, you're not getting a lot of information out of Congress in a bipartisan way. We used to be able to rely on the Intelligence Committee in Congress to kind of speak with one voice, but that's kind of fallen apart in the last year particularly. And so we're not getting the same kinds of briefings we would on that situation. I think the one thing we are absolutely certain of is that we know that some of these countries, particularly Russia and Iran, seem to be trying to do a lot on social media, and the Russians are good at it. I have seen some of the stuff that they are doing with bots and their troll farms to influence social media and the messages that come up the most. I've been doing research with a few computer scientists at another university where we were looking at what was going on Twitter during the impeachment, during different aspects of the impeachment. And the crazy thing was that what we were seeing was actually the narrative that was winning was a particular narrative that the Russians would have been really happy with. And when the computer scientists started digging down and trying to figure out, are these real people or are these bots that are putting out all these tweets? It was the bots that they were actually, and there were enough of them, they were controlling what showed up when we would just randomly grab a million tweets out of the Twitter sphere. to analyze. So we know they're involved in trying to sow dissension and division and misinformation. And that's hard to get a handle on. You see Facebook and Twitter and some of the other social media platforms trying to label it or trying to take it down when they catch it. But there's so many political decisions involved in, do you label something misinformation? Do you label it false or manipulated content? And what does that mean? And then what if you miss it on the other side? Are you now going to be accused of being partisan? And so the social media platforms are really nervous about how they do that. And they're kind of learning by trial and error. So we're really concerned about the degree of misinformation more than anything else. I have no idea what people what's going on in intelligence circles about whether election databases are being hacked or anything like that. I haven't heard anything concrete or confirmed about that, but I know it's a security concern.
Next question is one on the political science side. That is, we were sort of formed for 3 equal, quote unquote, branches to balance out each other and run a tight ship type of thing. So keep that in mind and what's happening with that balance wise, and tie that to the last 3 presidencies. We have this wonderful thing called executive orders that have really greatly avalanched in occurrence and possibly as well in impact without regard to balance. Would you care to comment on that as a political scientist?
Absolutely. And I think I'm glad somebody asked that. These are the things I try to get my students excited about, and they just kind of look at me like, yeah, right, okay. So I appreciate that question. You're right. Each presidency of these last 3 has kind of ratcheted up the grip on executive power. And the one thing I tell my students is that part of what the founders envisioned was that each branch, if you go back and read Federalist 51, written by James Madison, if you go back and read that, you will understand that he's saying they want to give each branch its own power and then just enough power to rein the others in. But the idea there is that your power within your institution will be most important to you if you're in an institution in government. So the justices will be worried about preserving judicial power. The Congress will be worried about preserving its congressional powers, and the president will, of course, be worried about preserving and possibly expanding his power. But the idea was, as long as they're each worried about preserving their own power, they're not going to let the other one get out of whack. The problem that we've had, and I think this is why you see this happening starting with Bush and going through Obama and Trump, is partisan polarization has changed the calculus of what's important to members of Congress. Party becomes more important than institutional power in Congress. And so you have seen across all 3 of those presidencies, whenever a House of Congress had its own party controlling the White House, it did very little oversight of the executive branch. It's only when you get a situation of divided government that you start to get any oversight being exercised from Congress. And for much of that time, we've had the Senate in control with one party and the House controlled by the other party. So you don't have a unified Congress trying to check the president. It's one House of Congress. That makes it harder. I do think we've seen the courts continue to weigh in on executive orders. We've seen the court during this administration strike down some things that the president has tried to do, not always for the substance of what he did, but for the process that he used. We saw the courts strike down Obama's attempt to add appointees that were not confirmed through the Senate in what he thought was a loophole, and the court said, nope, that's not a loophole. You're violating the letter of the law, even if you're not violating the spirit of the law. And we have to follow the letter of the law. So the courts have continued to try to check the president. But yes, Congress has completely abdicated that role if it's a president of their own party.
Okay, for the final question, again, political science-wise, is the reality that we're not a pure democracy in electing our presidents in particular. And so we have this neat thing called the popular vote, which everybody cares about. And then we have this other thing called the electoral college that's no one other than your students understand how it came to being and its purpose. How does that play out? How is it playing out, do you think? We know how it played out last time. And is there any change potentially going to happen? Or is it a wonderful, wonderful idea that has been around for hundreds of years, and so we ought to keep it?
Yeah, this is one of those, it's tough. I taught a group of students internationally one time about 3 years ago, right after Trump had gotten elected. And the Electoral College was a thing on their mind. They're just like, please explain to us why any sane group of people picked this. And it's like, well, they had their reasons at the time. It made a lot of sense. And even today, there's something to be said for it. You're right. It's not democratic. Democratic would be popular vote wins. But remember, the founders weren't worried so much about they wanted representation. They wanted an opportunity for deliberation. They did not necessarily think the majority should always win. They thought that minority rights should be protected, and that this would be one of a number of ways that we would ensure that in our system. There was also the effort practically that states matter, right? They were asking at the time states to give up some power to the national government, so they had to have something in there for the states. But even today, there are some legitimate reasons we might want states to matter. I think still from one pragmatic perspective, the Electoral College saves us a bit of headache of all these contested ballots. If we had to deal with those in every single state at every single level, this would be a nightmare for us in sort of the judicial process following our elections. We would be contesting everything. As it is, we now only have to worry about it happening in 1 or 2 states, right? It's Florida 2000. If you didn't have the Electoral College, every state would be Florida 2000 all over again. And that would be terrifying. So there are some good reasons to have it. But yes, it is frustrating to people who find themselves in the losing side of it. And it does seem to give an awful lot of power to a handful of states that mostly have livestock in them. You see the map and it's all red, and my students are going, look at all that red, the Republicans are winning. And I kind of say, there are more cows in that red than actual people in that red. And so it is sort of it doesn't sit well with us from a fairness perspective. I do think there are things that you could see happening. I mean, again, keep in mind, it's not been a lot that we've had the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. The problem is it's happened twice since 2000, right? That's a concern. But there were other things that could happen. Statehood for the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico would do some changing right then of the electoral calculus. Potentially adding seats to the House of Representatives. We're stuck at 435, you'd need to change that. But if you changed that, it would start adding seats, and it would add seats in those areas that are much more populous. And that would likely balance out in terms of the partisan differences. So there are a few things that could be done short of throwing out the Electoral College altogether.
Well, Danielle, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And for those of you who haven't voted already, you still have time.
Thank you. Thank you.